This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
Hello and welcome back to another lesson on learning to use the Greek New Testament. Today we're going to focus on the present, middle, and passive indicative. Now I don't know if all of those words just ring true with you in terms of their meaning, but hopefully by the end of today's lesson and by the end of this course, all of those things will be just automatic for you. Now when we talk about the middle and passive, what are we talking about? Well, let's go today right to the board and look at a couple of sentences. I want you to notice these two sentences right here. The first one, Jesus teaches the disciple. And the second one, the disciple is being taught by Jesus. Now, really, if you look at these sentences, they're different. But how are they different? And then also, how are they the same? Okay, so how are they different and how are they the same? Think about that for just a moment. Do they not convey the same message and the same idea? I think they certainly do, but they're being expressed in a different way, and maybe one emphasizes something over the other. Look at the first sentence. What's our subject here? The subject of our sentence is this one. In this sentence is Jesus. He's teaching, there's our verb, and here's the object of who's being taught or what's being taught, the disciple. So Jesus teaches the disciple. Now the next sentence, and by the way, this would be known as an active sentence. An active sentence, because the subject of our sentence is performing the action of this verb. It's doing the action. It's involved in the action of the verb, okay? Performing it or producing it, some say. And the disciple is the recipient. In this next sentence, you have what's known as a passive sentence. Here, the disciple, which is the subject of our sentence now, okay, is being taught by Jesus, which is the agent here in this sentence, okay? All right, so being taught is our verb, but instead of the subject of the sentence performing the action of the verb, in this sentence, the subject of our sentence is receiving the action of the verb. It's the recipient of the verb there, okay? It's the same idea, right, as Jesus teaches the disciple, but here perhaps we wanted to emphasize that the disciple is being taught, and then by Jesus is sort of the the reference as to who is actually performing the action of the verb, but we're saying it in a different way. Okay, so this is an active sentence and this is a passive sentence. Now, we perhaps are used to that in our own language of passive and active, and certainly we are. We use those all the time. Now, Greek does one other thing. It adds one other element of voice, and that is the middle voice. So you have three things that you could choose from: passive, middle, or active. And what I'd like for us to do today is to take a little bit better look at those to see what that means. Now, in studying verbs, remember this. We said that verbs have tense, and verbs have voice, and they have mood, and they have person, and they have number. Okay, those are the basic elements of a verb. And now I want you to step back and sort of take a large picture at what we have studied so far in terms of the indicative mood. Look at all of the tenses that we've studied so far in the indicative mood. Notice on this chart here, we have studied, if we start here from left to right, we've studied the aorist tense. All of this is indicative, indicating action, okay? We're not expressing a wish or a desire. There's no command or anything, but rather we're just talking about action that is, in effect, real action. Aorist, okay, imperfect, pluperfect, perfect, present, and future. Those are the tenses that we have studied so far. Then notice under each one of these tenses, there is voice. So that, for example, under the perfect tense, you have active, middle, and passive, and present. Active, middle, and passive. Active, middle, and passive. Each one of these tenses has voice. Okay? How is the aspect of that verb? What voice does it have? Is it in the active voice? Or is it in the passive voice? Is the action of that verb being performed by the subject of the sentence, or is it being done to the subject of the sentence, or in the case of the middle voice, for himself, as we'll talk about a little later on. Okay, so notice under each of these tenses, you have voice, active, middle, and passive. Now let's go to the present tense here. Notice, in the present tense, in the active voice, we learned that the endings were o, eis, a, amen, ete, usen. Okay, remember that? Here's our stem lu. So lu o, lu eis, lu e, lu amen, lu ete, lu isen, right? I loose, you loose, he, she, or it looses, we loose, you loose, they loose. And then if we went to the other tenses, we can remember our endings, ka, kas, ken, kamen, kate, kasen, for the perfect, with the time morph then prefixed and the reduplication of the stem. The pluperfect, very much the same thing. We just add our endings on there all the way down, okay? And then we have the reduplication of the stem, the first letter of the stem, that is. We have a time morph and another one here for our pluperfect. When we went to the imperfect, we spoke about the fact that we prefixed that epsilon, and that should be an epsilon all the way down there as well. And you have your endings, on, es, en, amen, ete, on. And then when we came to the aorist, same thing, sa, sen, samen, sate, san, right? With a prefixed time morpheme on the front here that's telling us, hey, pay attention to me, I'm past tense, right? Now, those were all active. Well, how do we know when a verb is middle or passive? How do we know when it goes from active to middle or passive? How do we recognize it? Again, by the endings, And what endings do we put on to the end of those words? Well, let's take a look at those. I'm going to write them for you on the board here. Notice that the endings would be my, psi, tai, metha, stay, entai. Okay? So those are going to be our endings. My, psi, tai, metha, stay, entai. Do you remember when we learned the endings o, eis, a, amen, ete, and usen? You remember those? Those are the present active indicative verb endings. First person, second person, third person, singular. First person, second person, third person, plural. Well, when a verb is thought of in the middle or passive voice, these are the endings that would go onto them. My, psi, tai, metha, stay, entai. Now, one other thing. Notice here, I've already written them down here under the present. You have, in between most of these endings, either an omicron or an epsilon. That's called the variable vowel, or the connecting vowel. And some people say that it was placed there for pronunciation purposes. I'm not really sure of the real reason behind all of that, and I think that may be logical. But at any rate, it's there. And in learning the endings, I just learn my, psi, tai, metha, stay, entai. My, psi, tai, metha, stay, entai. If you learn that, then you'll see those endings. And then just notice that there's a connecting vowel in between here. Now, one other little thing here that happens. When psi is in the present and in some other tenses, some things begin to happen. The epsilon basically drops out that would have been there, and the sigma as well. And what ends up happening to the iota is it just goes down here. It's subscripted under this eta, so it's just simply lue. So you'll need to pay attention to that and note that that is second person singular in regard to the present. That is psi, but it's just undergone some changes because of a contraction issue. So lu oomai, lu e, lu etai, lu ametha, lu este, lu antai. And the same thing for the passive. They're the same endings, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment as to why those endings are the same. So for now, I want you to just focus on these, my, psi, tai, metha, stay, entai. Get that in your mind so that you can remember what those endings are all about. Okay, I'll tell you a little interesting story, by the way, at this point. I remember one time watching a little show about Robert Tilton. I may have told you about this, but I want to remind you of it. He is a man that supposedly preaches the gospel, although he doesn't really preach the truth at all. But he is on the television, and sometimes one time he was being interviewed by a news correspondent, and he said, "Well, you say you speak in tongues. Can give us some tongues? Tell us." Give us an example of it. And he would start saying, "Oh, I say, amanetuusin, masatai, metasayentai, masatai, metasayentai." And I began to listen. I was going, wait a minute. That's not any kind of, supposed language from God. The word tongues meant a language. And but he was sort of fooling the people into thinking that somehow he was speaking an unknown language, but really he was just giving the verb endings from Greek that maybe a lot of people didn't recognize or understand. But anyway, I thought I would tell you that as just sort of an interesting story. But for right now, go ahead and just keep these in mind. Masatai, methasei, entai. Now, we've learned those endings. Get those in your mind. Let's talk a little bit more now about middle and passive voice and what that has reference to and active voice. Let's take a look at a few charts now as we think about the three voices of a Greek verb. The three voices of a Greek verb. First of all, there is the active. And what we mean by active is when the subject is represented as producing the action of the verb. And that's according to David Allen Black's book, not in our text that we're using, but in the text of It's Still Greek to Me. An example of that is God knows your hearts. God knows your hearts from Luke 16:15. See, God is the subject. Knows is the verb there. Knows is in the active voice. So God is the one knowing. God is the one producing the action. And what He knows is the heart. Okay, now the next one. He maketh His sun to shine on the evil and good. He maketh His sun to shine on the evil and good. He is the subject, talking about God, if we knew the context of Matthew 5:45. Maketh is the verb. He makes. God's the one that does that. His sun to shine on the evil and the good. He's the subject of the sentence. That sentence is active. The second voice in Greek, as we've noted, is the passive voice. The passive voice. Now, the passive voice denotes the subject as receiving the action. Receiving the action. Take a look at an example here in Acts 1:5. You will be baptized with the Holy Spirit. You is the subject of our sentence, okay? And then be baptized there is our verb, or baptized, right? So you will be baptized. See, they're not going to baptize someone. These individuals, that is in reference to the apostles here in Acts 1, when Jesus told them to wait in the city of Jerusalem, right? He told them to wait there. They're not the ones that were going to be doing the baptizing of the Holy Spirit upon somebody, but it was passive. That is, Jesus says, you're going to be baptized. The action is going to come back upon them, okay? All right, so that's the passive voice. Now, let's take a look now at the middle voice. Here's the third possibility, middle. And this is a little different because English doesn't really have this voice per se. Middle voice is when the subject of the sentence performs or produces the action on itself or for itself. Now, our reciprocal pronouns usually sort of take the place of that. See that again. When the subject of the sentence performs or produces the action on itself or for itself. Look at this example. Mark 14:54. Peter, and then there's part of the sentence verse I left out. Peter warmed himself by the fire. So warmed is the verb. Now himself, technically, if I recall, is not even in the Greek text. Warmed himself would all be this one word here. Warmed is an action that Peter is performing, but who is he performing it on? Right? This action of warming himself is being done by Peter, but it's something that's being done to him or for him. See, that's the essence of that middle voice verb there. And so if you saw that middle voice, and by the context you would know that he was doing that for himself, okay? All right, I think there's one more example that we want to share, and that is James 1:21. And that is, receive with meekness the implanted word, okay? That's something that James was saying, receive, okay? We should receive with meekness. All right, well, we receive it, it's something that we're doing for ourselves in the reception of the implanted word as we do it with meekness. That's something, it's in the passive, or middle voice rather. It's something that we're doing, we're performing the action, but we're doing it for ourselves, okay? Not just so that, you see, Mom and Dad will be happy, not just so that we can say, well, I'm doing this to please my preacher or whatever, but it's something that we're doing for ourselves and to ourselves, this reception of the word. So the active, middle, or passive are the three voices in the Greek with regard to verbs, of course. All right, now let's talk about how to recognize the present, middle, and passive. How to recognize the present, middle, and passive. Notice, we've already covered that, haven't we? My, sa, ta. Metha, sthe, entai. My, sa, ta, metha, sthe, entai. Those are the endings for how to, and if we can see that, then get that in our mind, we're going to be able to recognize that this is passive or it's middle. Passive or it's middle. Now, you say, well, how do I know? Because if we go back up here and we say that the endings, and if you'll remember from your book, the endings are the same for the passive. I just didn't write them up here as they are for the middle. How do I know which is middle and which is passive? You just have to know by the context. By the context of the sentence. That will tell you how best to do that. And the aspect of that verb, or the element of that verb, the meaning of it, I should say, will also indicate it to you. Okay? So that's recognizing it, and we focused on that. Now, secondly, I want us to take a moment and look at the use of the middle voice. The use of the middle voice. Now, in order to talk about this, what I'd like for you to do is to pick up your textbook. I thought this might expedite our study. And I want you to turn to page 79 because there's a very important sentence there that I want you to read and then highlight and underscore in one particular word. On that page, I want you to listen to it in regard to the use of the middle voice. In the middle voice, as we've said, the subject is involved in the action of the verb, right? We've already stated that. But the manner, and that's what I want you to underline as well, the manner of the involvement must be inferred from the context. Now he goes on to say, hence there is no single way of translating the middle voice into English, not just one way. Suggested translations from luomai, right, my is our ending for first person singular, include I am loosing myself, or I am loosing for myself, or I myself am loosing. And then he goes on to talk about the following uses of the middle voice then represent the general idea of the construction. And he mentions there the reflexive middle, the intensive middle, and the reciprocal middle. Now, don't worry about learning those right now. Don't even worry about, well, do I have to know the difference between the reflexive and the intensive and the reciprocal? Don't worry about that. Just know this, that when we talk about the middle voice, that we're typically thinking of the subject of our sentence performing or being involved in the action of that verb in some way, and that it is either some action that's being done to him or for him, or to the subject or for the subject, or receiving some benefit or something like that. But I just wanted you to have the general concept of that. I think some of these other things perhaps are maybe reserved for an intermediate study in Greek. But the uses of the middle voice. And one other thing I want to stress again, the difference between the passive and the middle, the endings in terms of their form are the same. The context will bear it out. The context of a sentence will bear it out as to how it would best be translated. Okay, let's take a look at another item now in regard to deponent verbs now. Deponent verbs. That's an interesting word, deponent. Deponent. The word deponent means basically, it comes from a Latin word which means to lay aside, to lay aside. And deponent verbs are this. They are verbs who have a form that is passive. Okay, its form, in other words, at the end of it, like erkomai. Erkomai is a deponent verb. You will not find erko ergo, the present active indicative omega on the end of that. It won't have an active form like that in the present tense. Okay, so it's passive in form, but it's active in meaning. It just means I come, ergomai, I come. Or rather, I go. I'm sorry, I always get that one confused. I go. So, ergomai means I go. You see, I go, not I. And how would you say it, by the way, in passive? You know, how would the going have reference to me? I'm not sure how you would best do that, except in this instance, you know, when you see the word deponent, think of it this way: passive in form, active in meaning. You might want to say that. Deponent means this: passive in form, active in meaning. Passive in form, active in meaning. That's what a deponent verb is. It looks like it's passive or middle, but it's active. And you say, well, how do I know? How do I know between that one and some other verb like lego or echo or something like that? It's when you learn the vocabulary words. When you learn those vocabulary words that we mentioned from this chapter that we learned about in the last section, the last session of the course, words like apokrinomai and archomai and genomai and decomai, those words, you'll learn them like that, decomai, and you'll just know, oh, those are deponent verbs, because that's the way you learned them, and you'll be able to differentiate them on that basis because you learned them that way. Okay, so just wanted to point that out to you, that that's what we mean by deponent. And there are some other things that Mr. Black goes on to talk about in that text that we're not going to focus on at this point. The next thing that I want you to be aware of in regard to the middle and passive has to do with agency. Has to do with agency. And you'll notice in his text now he says that a verb in the passive voice will often be followed by the identification of an agent. That is to say, the person or thing producing the action. Okay, now if we go to the board now, I want you to remember this sentence. The disciple, right? The disciple is being taught by Jesus. Jesus is the agent here. He's the one that is producing the action of that verb, and the action of it is coming back upon the subject of our sentence, the disciple. Okay? So that's what we mean by agency. Now, you see the word by there is indicating that to us. Now, in Greek, when it comes to Greek, I want you to understand that that agency can be expressed in about three ways. Three ways. And those are identified for you in your textbook. It can be a direct agent, in which case the action is performed is expressed by hupa. Hupa, our preposition hupa, and the genitive case that follows, so that it just simply means by. By, okay? And then he gives you some examples there. The sinners are being saved by God, okay? Or in this sentence we looked at on the board, by Jesus. Then another way that agency is expressed in terms of the intermediate agent through whom the original agent acts is expressed by dia. And then the word following it in the genitive case, okay? In the genitive case. So that if that word dia is found and then there's a word that follows it, a noun or whatever, in the genitive case, then you know that that's the agent that is actually performing the action of the verb. And then the last one is this impersonal agency is expressed by the dative case with or without in, as in hoi anthropoi, hoi harmatoloi, sodzantai to lago. Okay, to lago would mean the word, but that dative case that we usually translate as to or for, okay, is being used in a different way. Now I want you to remember something. Now listen carefully, because you remember early on in this course how I talked to you about the fact that there are only 5 cases in Greek. Well, there are only 5 for nouns, remember? Nouns have case, and case refers to how the noun is functioning in the sentence in relationship to other words in the sentence, so that if you have the nominative case ending that's functioning as the subject, if you have the dative or the accusative case ending, that noun is functioning as the direct object. Remember we said there are only 5 cases? Truly there are only 5 case endings, but there are other cases in Greek in terms of their function. The only way that you're able to tell it, though, is by the context. So in this instance, to lago, even though it has that dative case, that iota subscript under it, it's dative case, all right, but it is dative of instrument. Dative of instrument. It's the means by which something is being done. So in that sentence, if you were to look at it in your book, the men, the men are being saved by the word, or not the men, the sinners are being saved by the word of the Lord. Okay, so the agency there is being expressed by the dative case. The dative case. All right, so that's what we mean by agency. All right, so we've talked about deponent verbs, we've talked about agency, we talked about the uses of the middle voice, how to recognize it. Now let's try to put it all into action and take a look at some sentences on the board. Let's go to the board now and work some exercises, translate some sentences. Now go ahead and get out your textbook and take a look at the odd number sentences in your textbook just to see if you can work a few before we actually do them here on the board. If you want to stop the video at this point, that would be good. Otherwise, let's just work on them together, and then for your homework, you'll need to do the even-numbered sentences. I believe it's really important to work through these sentences as often as you can because each sentence is written and designed in order to reinforce the lessons from the chapter so that you get to see all the aspects of it and see the little nuances and the sort of the anomalies, as it were, as they occur. All right, well, let's go to the board now and take a look at these sentences. Number one, lu antai, hoi, douloi, hupa, ton, apostolon. Well, right away, I see something here that ought to catch my eye, and that here's my stem, lua, here's entai, that's a middle or passive ending, and you say, well, which is it? Well, we'll have to determine by the context. Got to have a subject, here it is, hoi douloi, that is the slaves. So the slaves now, we need to figure out how this verb is interacting with the subject of our sentence. Are the slaves performing something? Are they doing something? Or is something being done to them? Or are they doing something for themselves? Well, by the context of the sentence, because you have an agent down here, I can tell that it's being done to them. All right, but for now, take a look at this. This is, right, a passive or middle in form, right? Active, indicative, third person plural ending. Maisai tai, methasei, entai. So, passive. So the action or the element of this verb is being done to the subject. The subject is not performing the action of it. In other words, the slaves aren't loosing anybody, but rather the slaves are being loosed. The slaves are being loosed by who? Well, here's our agent, hupa. Remember we said this has reference to the immediate agency, or the immediacy, or the immediate agent is the apostles. See the plural? Ton, apostolon, on, the plural. So the slaves are being loosed by the apostles. There you go. That's the middle or the passive element of the nature of this verb here. All right, let's take a look at sentence number 2. Didaskatai, hey, all right, aletheia, dia, ton, huion, ton, matheton. Okay? Now, as you look at this, I like, again, to see my verbs, see my subjects right away. I know this is a verb, didaskatai, because I remembered my maisai tai, methasei, entai. Here's my variable vowel, or the connecting vowel. Here is the stem. You know the stem, didasko, which means I teach. But this is not active voice. This is, as in, all right, didasko is active. This is passive. What's the subject then? Here it is, the truth. The truth is the subject. So the truth isn't teaching something, but rather the truth is being taught. Okay? This truth is being taught. Okay? And then we have dia, ton, huion, ton, matheton. Here are all those ons. I know that's a unit forming together. All right? And then dia is the intermediate agent. So hupa and dia are both prepositions that can be used to express agency. agency, the means by which something is done. Okay, so how is the truth being taught? It's being taught by the sons of the disciples. Okay, by the sons of the disciples. So there you have an example of this immediate and this intermediate, okay, or this direct, really is what we should be saying, the direct use of this. And then you have this intermediate, okay, element involved with regard to dia. Just know that that's the agent. Don't worry about whether it's direct or intermediate. This is the agent. Those two prepositions are helping you to say whatever follows is the agent involved in performing the action of the verb. So in other words, technically speaking, it's the sons of the disciples that are teaching the truth. Okay? Now, number 3. Sodzetai ha pistos, mathetes, hupa tu kuriou. We go back here. Again, here is our passive voice. Sodze, sodzo is I save, sodzo. This is sodze. Here's my connecting vowel. My side tai. Okay. All right. And so my side tai, methiste in tai. And he, she, or it, right? Well, here's my subject. The faithful. The faithful. Here's my adjective that is actually in the attributive position, right? It immediately follows the article preceded by this mathetes. You say, oh, wait a minute, there's no agreement. Yes, there is. Remember, mathetes is a masculine noun from the first declension nouns. It agrees. It is a masculine noun, nominative, singular. So is this. So this all is an agreement. So the faithful disciple. The faithful disciple is being saved, right? The faithful disciple isn't saving anybody. Because this verb is passive, it means the action of this verb is being performed on the subject. Well, then where's our agency? Right here. By, hupa, the Lord, by the Lord. So we could easily change that into an active sentence and say that the Lord is saving the faithful disciple. That would be an active sentence, but this is a passive one. Okay? All right, so let's take a look now at sentence number 5. Sodzentai, hoi, oxloi, ek tu kosmu. All right, you might be tempted to think, well, here the agency is, we're being saved from or by the world, but again, you can't think that because ek doesn't mean that. It means out, all right, or exiting, right, out of, or from. So the crowds or the multitudes, entai, sozo, has reference to being saved or to save, but here it's passive. The crowds are being saved. The crowds aren't saving anyone. It's the crowds are being saved out of the world. And of course, we'd have to have a context of a sentence to know who it is or what's happening in terms of how those crowds are being saved. We know from the Bible, of course, that it would be the blood of Jesus and the gospel of salvation, Romans 1:16. All right, number 6, paneroi, anthropoi, doxodzentai, ala, dikaioi, anthropoi, doxodzusi, ton, theon. Now, what I want you to notice about this sentence is something very important. You have here in this sentence what I believe, if you look at the context, is the use of a middle, all right, voice here. Remember we said you have to determine it by the context because the forms are the same. If we look here, we've got some evil men, right? Evil men. This is our adjective, and these agree. Evil men. Now, doxadzo is glorify. Are evil men being glorified? Well, maybe if by the context of the sentence we saw that evil men are being glorified by Satan or something like that, but that's not the rest of the sentence. The rest of the sentence says, you know what? This is and should be translated as middle in that sense, that they're glorifying themselves. They're not being glorified. They're glorifying themselves. And how do I know that? Because if you continued reading the sentence, but, see the contrast? That's important. They're telling us there's a contrast here. But righteous men, what are they doing? They are being saved or rather are glorifying God. Okay? Righteous men, they glorify God. So I know because of this right here, setting up a contrast, and knowing that he's showing that righteous men glorify God, but on the other hand, evil men, they're not being glorified, because there's nobody here in the sentence that's saying they're being glorified, but basically by the context I can figure out that he's talking about they're glorifying themselves. And that makes sense to us, so that's why we would translate it in the middle there, even though this anti, again, its form is exactly the same for middle or passive. Now, finally, number 11. Hi, pistai, erkantai, kai, baptizantai, hupa ton apostolon. All right, what we have here is an example of a deponent verb. Here's our subject, all right, the faithful ones, but notice this is, what gender is it? It's feminine, that's right. It's feminine gender. So the faithful women, the faithful women. If it had been the faithful men, it had been hoi pistoi, the faithful men. All right, the faithful women, all right, what are they doing? Erkantai. You have a verb here. It's a deponent verb. Remember, what does deponent mean? Deponent means active in meaning but passive in form. Or as we've been saying, passive in form but active in meaning. Erkomai, which means go, I go. All right, erkantai is they go. So the faithful women are going. We're going to translate it as active, okay? Because I don't know how you would translate it as middle or passive, but it's deponent, so it's active in meaning. The faithful women are going, okay, are coming. I always get that mixed up. I apologize. The faithful women are coming, and what are they doing? And being baptized. Now you have a passive form, because baptizo, is not deponent. It's not deponent. It's just a regular old verb, and has a passive ending here, so they're being baptized, and here's the agency, by the apostles. Okay? So the faithful women are coming and being baptized by the apostles. By the apostles. Well, those are just some examples of some of the things that we've learned today in regard to the middle and the passive. And what you need to do now is to work on those sentences to ingrain that concept into your mind. And if you have trouble, read another grammar textbook that maybe might say it in a little different way that might help you to better understand what we're talking about. Well, that concludes today's lesson, except for our homework assignments. Let's take a look at that now. For your homework, translate the even-numbered sentences from chapter 12. Read carefully chapter 13. Memorize the assigned Greek vocabulary words that we worked on in the previous session, and then be prepared for class. Once again, I'm so glad that you have joined us in these sessions, and I hope and trust that they've been profitable to you. Just one little reminder, if you don't get this through, one of the benefits of World Video Bible School, one of the great things about the videotapes and the DVDs are that you can play them over and over again. If you don't get it the first time, you can go back, replay it, and it sometimes most people have to do that. A lot of people have to do that. I know I had to do it in taking Greek when I first started out, and still as I learn more and more, and as I study more about that, I have to go back and read it again. But after a while, it begins to sink in, and you build upon it. It's a building process. So stay with it. Hang in there. You'll get it. Keep working with it. All their great payoffs in the end, not only, of course, in terms of the here and the now, but in the world to come as we seek to serve the Lord. May God bless you, and may you continue to faithfully serve Him. And so until then, until our next session, I bid you a very pleasant good day.